A day that would change everything. It was a warm Wednesday afternoon when Captain Angela Pierce stepped out of her unmarked police car. She had just returned from a downtown meeting, her crisp uniform gleaming under the midday sun. Angela was a seasoned officer, one of the highest ranking in her precinct. Over the years, she had earned the respect of her peers through unwavering commitment and tireless dedication. Standing tall at 5'10", with sharp, confident eyes, she was not just another officer in the Central City Police Department. She was a leader, respected by all. Her ability to assess situations with incredible precision and make decisions in the heat of the moment was unmatched. Angela had worked her way up the ranks, dealing with the pressures and challenges that came with being one of the very few black women in law enforcement. She had faced resistance, both subtle and overt, but she never let it derail her. Her presence commanded respect. Her ability to lead others through the toughest situations was without question, and she had always been determined to break down the barriers that people like her faced every day. That particular afternoon, Angela had decided to stop by a small convenience store on her way back to the station. It was a quaint little shop tucked into the corner of an aging strip mall, a place she had frequented many times. The store's owner, Mr. Patel, was a kind older man with whom Angela had often exchanged pleasantries. Their brief conversations about neighborhood updates were one of the small joys in her otherwise demanding day. As she entered the store, she couldn't help but notice a slight buzz of tension in the air. It wasn't anything she could place, but it was there, hanging like a thick fog. She shook it off as the usual weight of a busy day settling on her shoulders. She approached the counter with a small bottle of water and a granola bar, greeting Mr. Patel with a warm smile. "Good to see you again, Captain Pierce," he said, his eyes lighting up in recognition. "Hey, Mr. Patel," Angela replied. "Just grabbing a quick snack before I head back to the station." The store was quieter than usual, the few customers that were inside watching the transaction with mild curiosity. But Angela was used to being a public figure, especially in this neighborhood. She was a familiar face, someone the community trusted. As she approached the register to pay, her eyes flicked to the back of the store, where a white officer stood, seemingly observing her. His arms were crossed, his posture stiff. His eyes, a piercing blue, followed her every movement, and an uncomfortable chill ran down her spine. It wasn't the kind of look that someone would give a fellow officer, especially not someone as senior as she was. She tried to dismiss the unease bubbling inside her, reminding herself that she was the captain, and he was just another officer. Still, his presence felt like a looming storm. She paid for her items and turned to leave, but just as her hand touched the door handle, she heard a voice call out to her from behind. "Excuse me, ma'am. I need to see some identification." Angela froze, her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she turned around to face the officer. He was younger than her, probably in his early 30s, with a chiseled jaw and short, cropped blonde hair. His name tag read Officer Rick Stevens. "ID?" she asked, raising an eyebrow, trying to mask the confusion in her voice. "What for?" "I saw you acting suspiciously in the store," Stevens said, his tone cold and filled with arrogance. "I'm going to need to see some identification." Angela's mind raced. Acting suspiciously. She had done nothing but pick up a water bottle and a granola bar. The store was a place she frequented often, and Mr. Paddle knew her by name. Her heart began to pound, the frustration building inside her as she tried to maintain her composure. "Officer Stevens, I'm Captain Angela Pierce," she said firmly, her voice calm but betraying a hint of disbelief. "I don't need to show you my ID unless you have a legitimate reason to ask for it. I've been in this store dozens of times, and I've never stolen anything." Stevens narrowed his eyes, clearly undeterred by her response. He took a small step closer, his hand resting casually on the holster of his gun. Angela's stomach tightened as she felt the heat of the situation escalating. "I saw you handling merchandise and acting like you were going to steal something," Stevens sneered. "I'm asking you one last time. Let me see your ID, or I'll have to detain you." Angela could feel the blood in her veins begin to boil. Steal something. A bottle of water and a granola bar. The insult was unbearable. But as much as it angered her, she knew what was really happening. She didn't need to look at the officer's posture to know what was behind this accusation. This wasn't about the items she had picked up. This wasn't about shoplifting. This was about her skin color. She took a deep breath, grounding herself. "Officer Stevens," she said slowly, her voice unwavering despite the rage building within her, "you're making a huge mistake. And if you don't have a legitimate reason to stop me, I suggest you reconsider." Stevens' eyes flashed with defiance. "Turn around. Put your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for suspicion of theft." The words hit her like a slap to the face. She blinked in disbelief. This was happening. Here she was, a highly respected officer, a captain no less, being arrested for something she hadn't done. She looked around, hoping that someone would step in, but the few customers in the store had frozen, their eyes wide with shock. Mr. Paddle stood behind the counter, his face pale, clearly too afraid to speak up. Angela's hands clenched at her sides. She was being humiliated in public. Her badge, her rank, none of it mattered now. She could feel the anger rising within her, but she knew that reacting impulsively could make everything worse. "Officer Stevens, you're going to regret this," Angela said firmly, but her voice shook with barely contained fury. "Are you threatening me?" Stevens sneered. "You think you're above the law, huh? Just because you're some big shot captain." Angela didn't reply. She just turned around slowly and placed her hands behind her back, allowing Stevens to cuff her. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into her skin, but it was the humiliation that hurt the most. She was being marched out of the store, her hands shackled, in front of the very people she had dedicated her career to serving. Outside, the sun was relentless, bearing down on her as Stevens shoved her roughly toward his squad car. The eyes of passersby followed her, their expressions a mixture of confusion, pity, and disbelief. Some of them pulled out their phones, no doubt recording the scene. Angela kept her head high, refusing to break, but inside, her mind was spiraling. She had always prided herself on keeping her composure, but now she had to stay calm, even though everything in her wanted to fight back. "Stevens," she said, her voice steady but laced with an edge, "you're making a mistake. Walk away from this before it blows up in your face." Stevens smirked, clearly enjoying his position of power. "A threat, Captain? Sounds like a threat to me." "Don't mistake my words," Angela replied, her jaw clenched. "This isn't about being above the law. It's about you abusing your power." But Stevens didn't care. He shoved her into the back of the squad car and slammed the door shut. Angela was left to sit in the stifling heat, her mind racing. She had always been on the other side of these arrests, leading her officers and making decisions to keep the peace. Now, here she was, the one being arrested for something she didn't do. As the car slowly began to drive toward the precinct, Angela stared out of the window, her thoughts swirling. There was something deeply wrong about this. Stevens was playing a dangerous game, and it was clear that he was using his power to target her for something far deeper than a simple accusation. Angela had been through countless difficult situations, but this was different. She had to stay calm. She had to outsmart him. And somehow, she had to prove that she was being set up. This was only the beginning. The road to the precinct. The drive to the precinct felt like an eternity. Every passing moment stretched into something unbearable, each second heavier than the last. Inside the squad car, Angela sat in silence, her wrists still bound by the cold metal cuffs. The heat from the sun outside seemed to amplify the oppressive air inside the car, making it harder to breathe. Her back pressed uncomfortably against the hard seat, and the wire mesh divider between her and Officer Stevens seemed to separate her from the reality she once knew. Officer Stevens, who had been driving with a smug smirk plastered across his face since the moment he arrested her, hadn't said a word. His silence was unsettling, almost as if he was savoring the moment, relishing in the power he had over her. Angela could feel the pulse of anger growing in her chest, but she fought to suppress it, every fiber of her being screamed for her to lash out, to demand justice, to remind him of her rank and the years she had spent serving her community. But she knew better. One wrong move, one misplaced word, and she could make the situation far worse. For now, she had to play the waiting game. She had to gather her thoughts, to formulate a plan to get out of this mess. Her mind raced with possibilities, every scenario playing out in her head, each one darker than the last. The frustration, the humiliation, it all burned inside her. But she kept her face neutral, her eyes focused on the road ahead, refusing to show any weakness. Not here, not now. As they neared the precinct, Angela's heart began to race. She had spent countless hours here, overseeing investigations, managing officers, and keeping the peace. The precinct was where she had built her career, where she had earned the trust of her colleagues and the respect of the community. Now it felt like a foreign place. It felt as though she was entering a different world, a world where she wasn't the leader, the captain, but a criminal. When Stevens turned the corner into the precinct's parking lot, Angela felt a wave of dread wash over her. The familiar sight of the building, the yellow police barricades, the rows of squad cars, they all felt like an inescapable trap now. She had spent so many hours here, working side by side with officers she considered her brothers and sisters in arms, but now she was just another suspect being processed like any other criminal. The thought of walking through those doors in handcuffs, of being reduced to a mere number in their system, filled her with an indescribable rage. But there was no turning back. The car came to a slow stop in front of the entrance. Stevens threw the car in park and got out without saying a word. He walked around the back of the vehicle, his steps deliberate, almost too slow, as if he were savoring the moment. Angela's eyes flicked to the few officers on duty in the parking lot. They looked at her, some of them startled, others confused. But no one spoke, no one moved to intervene. They all knew who she was. They all knew the rank she held. And yet, not a single one stepped forward to question Stevens' actions. Stevens yanked open the back door of the squad car and yanked Angela roughly to her feet, his grip tight on her arm. Angela winced at the force, but she refused to show weakness. She locked eyes with him, her jaw set in defiance. Stevens just sneered in response, as if enjoying every moment of her discomfort. "Let's go, Captain," he said mockingly, his voice dripping with condescension. As he dragged her into the building, Angela could feel the stares of her colleagues on her. The lobby, usually bustling with activity, had fallen eerily silent. Officers, detectives, and staff all stopped in their tracks, eyes wide in disbelief, as they watched her being escorted through the door, handcuffed and humiliated. The whispers began almost immediately, low murmurs of shock and confusion. Some officers tried to make sense of what was happening, while others just stood there, frozen, unsure of how to react. Angela's gaze swept over the room, her mind trying to process everything at once. There was Officer Reynolds, the officer she had worked closely with for years. His face was filled with confusion, but he said nothing as Stevens pushed her past him. Angela didn't blame him, not entirely. She knew the system was designed to keep everyone in their lane, to keep them from questioning the authority of their fellow officers, even when it was clear something was terribly wrong. The tension in the room was thick, like a fog that refused to lift. Angela felt it pressing in on her, suffocating her with each step. She could hear the murmur of voices, the disbelief, the uncertainty. Her colleagues, the people who had trusted her, who had looked to her for guidance, were now watching as she was reduced to a mere criminal. She could feel their judgment, their eyes weighing her every movement, and she hated every second of it. "Stevens, what the hell is going on here?" Officer Reynolds asked, his voice low but filled with concern. Stevens didn't even look at him. "Caught her red-handed," he said with a dismissive wave. "She was about to walk out of the store with stolen merchandise. I'm just doing my job." Angela's heart sank. The lie was so blatant, so obvious, that it nearly made her sick. Stevens had crafted this whole situation, this entire narrative, with such ease. He was playing the game, and he was doing it at her expense. She wanted to speak, to yell out the truth, to expose his lies, but she knew better. Anything she said would only make her look more guilty in the eyes of those who didn't know her. It wasn't just about the theft. It was about the lie he had constructed, about the image he had painted of her as a criminal. "Captain Pierce," Reynolds said quietly, clearly struggling to process the situation. "Is this true?" Angela opened her mouth to speak, but Stevens cut her off before she could utter a word. "Of course it's true," he said, his tone dripping with satisfaction. "She's trying to deny it, but we all know the truth." Angela clenched her jaw, her fists at her sides. She wanted to scream at him, to demand that everyone see the truth, but she kept her composure. She had been in situations far more dangerous than this, and she had always come out on top. This was no different. She would not let Stevens win. She would not let him destroy everything she had worked for. Reynolds, still looking unsure, turned to Angela. "Captain," he said, his voice hesitant, "you've been here longer than I have. You've been through everything with us. Is this really happening?" Angela met his gaze, her eyes full of resolve. "Reynolds, I didn't steal anything. I don't know what Stevens is trying to do, but this is a setup. I need you to believe me." Reynolds hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between his duty and his knowledge of Angela's character. But he said nothing, instead grabbing a stack of paperwork and slamming it down on the desk in front of him. "Let's just get you processed," he muttered. Angela stood still, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, their judgment heavy in the air. She was about to be processed like any other criminal. She was about to be reduced to a set of fingerprints, a mug shot, and a file in a drawer somewhere. She had worked so hard to get where she was, and now she was being torn down by a lie. "Captain," Reynolds said, his voice softer now, "we need to get your prints. It's standard procedure." Angela nodded stiffly. "Do what you have to do." She felt her pulse quicken as Reynolds placed her fingers on the cold ink pad. Each print felt like a mark of shame, each one a reminder of the humiliation she was enduring. The process was mechanical, impersonal, but it felt like an assault on everything she had worked for. When it was over, she was directed to the camera for her mug shot. The flash of the camera seemed to burn itself into her memory. For a brief moment, it felt like the world had paused, like her identity was being stripped away. The picture was more than just a record. It was a permanent mark of this moment, this false accusation that she would carry with her forever. Angela didn't speak as she faced Stevens again, her eyes narrowing. "Why are you doing this, Stevens?" she asked, her voice calm but filled with steel. "What's your game here? Do you really think no one will figure out that this is all a setup?" Stevens' expression didn't change. He just tilted his head, pretending to consider her question. "Game? There's no game here, Captain. I'm just doing my job. You're the one who seems to have forgotten how to do yours." Angela's blood boiled at his words, but she held her ground. She wasn't going to let him win. Not now. Not ever. This fight was far from over. The system closes in. The moment the mugshot flash faded, Angela felt the full weight of the situation crash down on her. Standing there, with her wrists still tightly bound by the handcuffs, she was no longer the confident, commanding officer she had been only hours before. She wasn't the respected captain of the Central City Police Department, overseeing teams of officers with poise and authority. No, in this moment, she was just another face in the system, reduced to a suspect, her career, reputation, and dignity all hanging by a thread. The injustice stung more sharply than anything she had ever encountered in her years of service. Stevens stood there, smirking as if he had already won, his posture relaxed and satisfied. He reveled in his moment of triumph, the humiliation of his superior officer, a woman who had worked harder than anyone to reach the top, serving as a testament to his own twisted sense of power. Angela locked eyes with him, trying not to let her disgust show, but it was impossible to suppress the storm of emotion churning inside her. "Is that all?" she asked, her voice low and calm, but there was an edge to it. "Are you done ruining my life for something I didn't do?" Stephen's smile widened, his smugness unchecked. "We'll see how much you smile when this is over. You're going down, Pierce. You were always a problem. And now you've finally shown your true colors." The words were calculated, intended to provoke a reaction, but Angela refused to give him the satisfaction. Instead, she focused on the one thing that still gave her a sense of control: her mind. She had been through countless situations that required quick thinking and strategy, and now was no different. Her mind raced through options, through plans, through the best way to handle this increasingly perilous situation. As she stood there in the booking area, the officers around her shuffled papers and glanced in her direction. No one made eye contact, and no one dared to speak up. The silence was suffocating. Angela could feel the weight of their judgment, the whispers that circled her like vultures. They didn't know what was really happening here, but that didn't stop them from believing Stevens. It wasn't just about the theft. It was about something far deeper. The racism that had always existed, quietly simmering beneath the surface, had finally found an outlet, and Angela was now its target. "Let's get this over with," Reynolds finally said, his voice hesitant. He looked uncomfortable, caught between his duty and the sense of unease that had clearly taken root within him. "We'll process you, and then you'll be taken to a holding cell." Angela nodded. She had expected nothing less. This was the system at work, grinding away without mercy. She had spent years observing it from the outside, seeing how it functioned, how it protected its own, especially when the truth was inconvenient. Now she was on the other side of it, trapped in a system that cared more about maintaining its order than uncovering the truth. It wasn't just a matter of processing her fingerprints. It was a matter of erasing her existence within the system, reducing her to just another suspect. Reynolds led her down a narrow hallway toward the holding cells. Each step echoed in the silence, each footfall a reminder of how far she had fallen from grace in the eyes of her colleagues. The walls of the precinct, which had once felt like a second home, now felt like a prison. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a cold, harsh glow on the barren concrete floors. It was a far cry from the vibrant, bustling energy that had once filled the halls. Now it felt empty, like a place where the truth was irrelevant, where everything could be twisted to fit the narrative that those in power wished to create. As they reached the holding area, Angela could hear the distant sound of voices, muffled conversations from other officers, the occasional clinking of keys as someone was processed. There were a few officers stationed nearby, but they, too, didn't meet her eyes. They had all been conditioned to trust one another, to follow the chain of command without question. And right now, the chain of command was broken, twisted by the lies of Officer Stevens. Reynolds unlocked a holding cell and motioned for Angela to step inside. The cold, metallic bars loomed ahead, a stark contrast to the warm, familiar halls of the precinct she had once walked with such confidence. The small, dimly lit room was bare, with only a hard bench and a small toilet. It was a room designed to strip away dignity, to remind those within of their place in the system. Angela hesitated for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the cell. The reality of her situation hit her like a physical blow. She had spent so many years keeping the peace, upholding justice, but now she was just another person, another criminal in the eyes of the law. The irony of it all was suffocating. Reynolds stepped back, his face unreadable. "I'll be in touch, Captain," he said softly, his voice almost apologetic. "We'll figure this out." Angela didn't respond. There was nothing more to say. She was beyond words now, beyond the point where reasoning and logic could solve the problem. She had to wait. That was all she could do. Wait for someone to believe her, to uncover the truth. But deep down, she knew the system was not kind to those who were framed, especially when the perpetrator had so carefully orchestrated every detail. As the door clanged shut behind her, the sound echoed through the empty hallway, the finality of it cutting through the silence like a knife. She sat on the bench, her hands still cuffed, her back stiff and tense. The walls around her seemed to close in, the fluorescent lights above flickering erratically, casting eerie shadows on the concrete floor. The stillness was suffocating, but Angela couldn't let herself succumb to it. She had to stay strong. She had to think. She closed her eyes, trying to focus. She replayed the events from earlier in the store in her mind. Officer Stevens had been there, waiting. He had been watching her from the moment she entered, his eyes glued to her every movement. He had orchestrated this entire thing. The accusation of theft, the confrontation, the arrest. It had been planned. But why? What was his endgame? What did he stand to gain from this? The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. Stevens wasn't just targeting her because of the theft. That was a mere excuse, a thin veneer covering something much deeper. He was targeting her because of who she was, a black woman in a position of power. He was threatened by her success, by her authority. His racism wasn't just a subconscious bias. It was an active, malicious force that drove his actions. Angela's fists clenched at her sides. The more she thought about Stevens and the way he had treated her, the more the truth became undeniable. He had chosen her as a target because he thought he could get away with it. He thought he could break her, but he had underestimated her. She wasn't going to let him win. No matter what it took, no matter how long it took, she was going to fight back. She had spent her life fighting for justice, and this was no different. The system had failed her, but she wasn't going to let it crush her spirit. She would prove her innocence, and when she did, she would make sure Stevens would never have the power to do this to anyone else again. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. She tensed, her mind racing. She wasn't sure if it was Reynolds returning or someone else, but when the door to her cell opened, she didn't expect to see the face that appeared before her. It was Lieutenant Hayes, one of the senior officers she had worked with for years. Hayes' sharp blue eyes scanned the room, pausing for a brief moment as they settled on Angela. There was no surprise in Hayes' expression, no hesitation, just a quiet, determined resolve. "Pierce," Hayes said, her voice hard and direct. "We need to talk." Angela's heart skipped a beat. She stood up slowly, trying to read Hayes' expression. There was something in her demeanor that was different from the others. Hayes wasn't here to judge her. She wasn't here to question her. Hayes was here to find out the truth. And for the first time in hours, Angela allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. "Let's talk," Angela said, her voice steady. "But make no mistake, this isn't over. I'm not going down without a fight." The truth unravels. The cold concrete floor beneath Angela's feet seemed to vibrate with every passing moment. Lieutenant Hayes stood before her, the door to the holding cell still ajar, allowing the low hum of distant voices from the precinct to drift in. Angela couldn't tell if the quiet was more unnerving than the noise. Her world had shrunk to this small, dimly lit cell, and for the first time, she felt utterly isolated, as if no one in this building, not even the people she had worked alongside for years, could truly understand the gravity of what was happening. Hayes took a step forward, her eyes never leaving Angela's. There was a quiet resolve in her expression, but it was mixed with something Angela couldn't quite place. It wasn't sympathy. Hayes was not the type for pity, but there was an understanding, a familiarity that spoke volumes. Hayes had been a senior officer when Angela first joined the force. They had been through tough calls together, survived high-pressure situations, and supported each other when things got difficult. "Pierce," Hayes said softly, but with a firm edge, "tell me what happened." Angela's chest tightened, but she took a slow breath. She had known Hayes long enough to understand that this wasn't a casual question. Hayes wasn't looking for a simple explanation. She was looking for the truth, and Angela was ready to give it to her. She wasn't going to let Stevens' lie stand. Not like this. It started when I walked into Patel's store, Angela began, her voice steady but laced with anger. I was just grabbing a bottle of water and a granola bar. Nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary. I've been in that store dozens of times. The owner, Mr. Patel, knows me by name. We chat about the neighborhood sometimes. I wasn't doing anything wrong. Hayes nodded, her gaze sharp as she took in every word. She didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions yet. She was listening, processing. And then I noticed him, Angela continued, her voice growing firmer as the memory of the incident flooded back. Officer Stevens. He was standing at the back of the store, watching me. His posture was stiff, like he was waiting for something. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And then, as I was heading out, he stopped me. He demanded my ID, accused me of acting suspiciously. Angela's breath caught in her throat as she recalled the look on Stevens' face, the arrogance, the coldness in his eyes. It still made her stomach churn. She had never been treated like that, especially not by someone who should have been her equal. Suspiciously, Hayes echoed, her brow furrowing. You've been working in this precinct for years, Pierce. No one who knows you would ever believe that. I know, Angela said, her fists clenching. But that's the point. This wasn't about my actions. This was about who I am, about my skin color, and Stevens knew it. Hayes remained silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She crossed her arms, looking down at the ground as though weighing the implications of Angela's words. Then, with a slow nod, she turned to look at Angela directly. I've worked with Stevens for years, Hayes said, her voice low, almost to herself. I've seen him act out before, but nothing like this. This isn't just about racism, Pierce. He's playing a game, and I don't know the full extent of it yet, but it's bigger than you and me. It's bigger than the department. Angela's heart skipped a beat. She had known Stevens was trouble, but she hadn't expected this. To hear Hayes, someone she respected deeply, acknowledge that Stevens might be part of something more sinister sent a chill down her spine. What do you mean bigger? Angela asked, her voice tight with urgency. Hayes sighed, rubbing the back of her neck as if unsure how much to say. I've been hearing things, rumors, and not just about Stevens, about the department itself. People being targeted, false reports being filed, things swept under the rug. There's a system in place that protects certain individuals, but it also feeds off of this kind of manipulation. Stevens may have been just a cog in the wheel, but this could be something much more dangerous. Angela's mind reeled. She had heard whispers before, but she had always dismissed them as paranoia or exaggerated claims from disgruntled officers. But now, hearing Hayes speak so carefully, so measured, Angela realized the truth she had been avoiding. The corruption, the manipulation, it wasn't just a fluke. It wasn't just Stevens. It was systemic, and she had unwittingly stepped into its jaws. How deep does it go? Angela asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hayes met her gaze, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and determination. I'm not sure yet, but I'm going to find out. For you, for all of us. Angela nodded, the weight of the moment settling over her. She had always prided herself on fighting for justice, but now the very system she had worked within had turned against her. She had been targeted, framed for something she didn't do. And now, it seemed, she was fighting not just for her career, but for something far greater. She was fighting for the truth. Hayes moved closer, lowering her voice. I need you to stay calm. Stay smart. Don't make any rash moves. The department's going to be watching you. They're going to try to make this disappear, but we can't let them. We have to make them listen. Angela's chest tightened. She had never felt more vulnerable. She had been a beacon of strength for so many, but now she was trapped in a nightmare of someone else's making. The idea that Stevens might have had allies in high places, that the system could be rigged in favor of those who used their power to manipulate, made her blood run cold. "You're not alone in this," Hayes added, her voice soft but resolute. "I won't let them sweep this under the rug. But you need to trust me. This isn't going to be quick. It's going to take time. But we will expose what's going on. I'll make sure of it." Angela's mind raced as she processed everything Hayes had said. She couldn't afford to fall apart now. Not when she was this close to the truth. She had to remain strong, to hold her composure, and most importantly, she had to make sure Hayes had everything she needed to build her case. She couldn't just wait in this holding cell for someone to rescue her. She had to fight for herself. "I trust you, Lieutenant," Angela said, her voice steady. "But if we're going to take Stevens down, if we're going to expose everything, we need evidence. We need to find a way to prove this isn't just about me, that this is about something much bigger." Hayes nodded, her eyes gleaming with determination. "I'm already working on it. We'll get the evidence, Pierce. I'm not letting Stevens destroy you, or anyone else, for that matter." As Hayes turned to leave, Angela couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. This fight was far from over. The road ahead would be long, and there would be countless obstacles. But with Hayes on her side and the resolve to uncover the truth, Angela knew she could weather whatever storm Stevens and the system threw at her. The battle was just beginning, and Angela wasn't going to back down. Tipping the scales, Angela sat alone in the holding cell, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Hayes' words echoed in her head, a fragile thread of hope amidst the chaos. The lieutenant was investigating Stevens, and possibly the rot in the precinct itself. But as much as Angela trusted Hayes, the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on her. She had been framed. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand, and now, trapped behind bars in the same precinct she had once ruled, she could only wait. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly. The silence in the cell was deafening, broken only by the occasional clatter of keys or the murmur of distant voices outside. Angela tried to keep her mind focused, but the humiliation of the situation, combined with a deep sense of betrayal, threatened to break her. She had built a career in law enforcement, earned respect through years of dedication, and now she was being reduced to a mere suspect, her reputation tarnished by lies. The longer she sat, the more she realized that this wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about proving her innocence. The stakes were much higher. Stevens wasn't a rogue officer working alone. The corruption was bigger than she had ever imagined. It ran deep, through the very foundations of the department. If she was going to clear her name, she couldn't do it alone. She needed allies, and she needed to be smart about how she made her move. Just as she was lost in her thoughts, the sound of footsteps outside the cell caught her attention. She stood up instinctively, her hand brushing against the cold bars. She knew it wasn't Hayes. The footsteps were too heavy, the rhythm too slow. The door to the cell opened, and standing there was Officer Reynolds, his face drawn with concern. "Captain," he said, his voice low, "can we talk?" Angela's heart skipped a beat. Reynolds was a good officer. She had worked with him for years, and she could see the unease in his eyes. But she didn't know if she could trust him fully. The department was divided, fractured between those who wanted to protect the truth and those who, for whatever reason, were determined to cover it up. "Of course," Angela replied, her voice steady but tinged with wariness. "What's going on, Reynolds?" He hesitated for a moment, glancing over his shoulder as if to ensure no one was listening. Then he stepped closer, lowering his voice even further. "I don't know all the details, Captain, but something's not right. Stevens, I've worked with him long enough to know he's trouble. But this is different. I've heard rumors, things that don't sit well with me. I think there's more to this than just you and him. I think Stevens might be part of something bigger. Angela's stomach churned. She had suspected it, but hearing Reynolds say it out loud made it feel all too real. There was a network, a system of corruption operating within the precinct, and Stevens was one of the many cogs in that machine. I knew it, Angela said quietly. Hayes said the same thing. But I don't know who to trust anymore. I don't know if I can trust anyone in this place. Reynolds looked conflicted. His eyes darted nervously, and for a moment, it seemed like he might back away, unwilling to get involved in something so dangerous. But then he squared his shoulders, his expression hardening. I've got your back, Captain, he said quietly. But we have to be careful. If Stevens has friends in high places, then making a wrong move could cost us everything. I know that's not what you want to hear, but it's the truth. We need to be strategic. We need evidence, something concrete that we can use to bring him down. If we're going to expose Stevens and anyone else involved in this, we need to play it smart. Angela nodded, her mind already working through the possibilities. What do you suggest? Reynolds leaned in closer. I've been trying to dig into Stevens' background. There's something off about the way he operates. He's been involved in a lot of shady dealings, small things, not enough to get him in trouble, but enough to raise suspicions. I've got some contacts who might be able to help, but I can't do it alone. You need to stay out of sight for now. Keep your head down and let me do the talking. If Stevens thinks you're on the inside, it could ruin everything. I'll make sure you're kept out of the loop, but I'm going to gather information. If I can find something that connects him to a larger network, then we can move forward. Angela considered his words carefully. She trusted Reynolds, but she also knew the risks. She wasn't the type to sit idly by while someone like Stevens got away with this, but Reynolds was right. They needed a plan. They needed leverage. All right, Angela said, her voice steady with resolve. I'll lay low for now, but if you find anything, you bring it to me. Don't go through the chain of command. Stevens has too many allies in high places. We have to work outside the system. Reynolds hesitated before nodding, his expression tight. You're right. It's going to take time. But we'll get there, Captain. One step at a time. With a final glance, Reynolds stepped back and exited the cell, leaving Angela alone again with her thoughts. She didn't know what the next few days would bring, but she knew one thing for sure. Stevens wasn't going to get away with this. He had made a dangerous mistake by targeting her, and now it was time for him to pay the price. The next few days dragged on, each one filled with a quiet tension that Angela could feel in the pit of her stomach. She hadn't heard from Reynolds since their conversation, but she knew he was working, digging into Stevens' past, trying to uncover something that would be the key to bringing the officer down. Angela spent her days in her cell, her mind constantly shifting between moments of frustration and moments of clarity. There were times when the anger threatened to overwhelm her, but she refused to let it consume her. She had too much at stake. Then, one afternoon, the door to the holding cell opened again. This time, it wasn't Reynolds. It was Hayes. The lieutenant's face was unreadable as she stepped into the cell, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Angela stood up immediately, her heart pounding in her chest. "Did you find something?" Angela asked, her voice tight with anticipation. Hayes didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked over to the small bench where Angela had been sitting and took a seat, exhaling a long breath. The silence between them was heavy, but Angela didn't break it. She had learned over the years that Hayes spoke when she was ready, and not a moment sooner. Finally, Hayes spoke, her voice low but steady. "I've got a lead. It's not much, but it's a start." Angela felt a rush of hope, though she kept her expression neutral. "Tell me." "Stevens has been linked to some off-the-books dealings," Hayes continued, her eyes narrowing. "I'm talking about things that shouldn't be happening at all. Money laundering, drug busts gone wrong, things that don't add up. But it's all buried. I've got a couple of sources who can confirm it, but they're afraid to go on the record. They've seen how Stevens operates. He's not just a bad cop. He's part of something bigger. Angela's pulse quickened. This was the break they needed. We need to get that information out into the open. Hayes nodded. I'm working on it. But for now, we need to lay low. If Stevens finds out we're onto him, he'll shut everything down. We need more evidence before we make any moves. Angela took a deep breath, her mind racing. This was the start of something huge, something that could bring down Stevens and the corruption lurking in the department. But it was going to take time, patience, and most importantly, it was going to take courage. We'll get him, Angela said firmly, her voice filled with conviction. I'm not going to let Stevens win. Not this time. Hayes stood up and gave her a brief, encouraging nod. Stay strong, Pierce. We're getting closer. The web unravels. Angela's world had shifted beneath her feet, but in the stillness of the holding cell, she was forced to confront the overwhelming weight of the situation. Every passing day felt like a battle between hope and despair as she slowly began to accept the harsh reality. Her career, her reputation, and her future hung by a fragile thread. But Hayes had given her a glimmer of hope. The investigation into Stevens was starting to yield results. It wasn't enough yet, but it was progress. The weight of the corruption that had been quietly festering in the department was beginning to surface, and Stevens, despite his best efforts, was starting to show cracks in his armor. Angela spent her days pacing the confines of her cell, mentally reviewing every detail that could possibly help them piece together a case. Reynolds had promised to continue his work, quietly collecting information without raising suspicion. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when Angela questioned whether or not Stevens had already buried his tracks too well. But Hayes was resolute. She believed there was a way to break the web that Stevens had spun, and Angela wasn't about to lose faith now. The days dragged on, but with each passing one, she grew more and more determined. The support from Hayes and Reynolds was the lifeline she needed. The precinct was watching her, but no one had yet realized that Angela wasn't just sitting idly by, waiting to be forgotten. She was playing a careful game, waiting for the moment when she would strike. Then, one morning, Angela was abruptly awakened by the sound of keys jangling outside her cell. Her heart skipped in her chest as she quickly stood to her feet. She had spent so long in isolation that the prospect of seeing someone, anyone, felt like a shock to her system. The door swung open, and standing in the doorway was Reynolds, his expression grim but focused. "Captain," he said quietly, stepping inside. "We've got something." Angela's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile moment of progress. Reynolds hesitated, then pulled out a small folder from under his arm. He opened it carefully, as if to guard the contents within from prying eyes. Inside were copies of documents, reports, emails, and records that seemed innocuous at first glance. But Angela could see the patterns forming, the connections beginning to crystallize. "I dug deeper into Stevens' background," Reynolds explained, his eyes flicking over to ensure no one else was listening. "There's a lot of smoke here, Captain. He's been involved in more than just petty schemes. The deeper I go, the clearer it becomes that Stevens is connected to something much bigger. Money laundering, trafficking, and even ties to organized crime. But the most disturbing thing, he's been using his position to shield these activities, not just here in the precinct, but across the city." Angela's stomach churned. She had known Stevens was trouble, but she hadn't anticipated anything this extensive. The weight of what Reynolds had uncovered hit her like a freight train. If Stevens was involved in organized crime and had been manipulating his badge to cover up such activities, it wasn't just a matter of clearing her name anymore. It was about bringing down an entire criminal network that had been hiding in plain sight under the guise of law enforcement. She looked at Reynolds, her voice steady but filled with disbelief. "How did you get these?" Reynolds sighed, glancing down at the folder before meeting her gaze. I had to go outside the department for help. I spoke to a few contacts, people who knew Stevens back when he was just a rookie. They'd been seeing the signs for years, but they were too scared to come forward. They're afraid of what might happen to them if Stevens finds out. Angela nodded, understanding all too well the fear that ran through those who had witnessed Stevens' rise to power. It wasn't just his power as an officer. It was his manipulation, his ability to silence anyone who posed a threat to his empire. But these documents, Angela began, her voice faltering. This is the kind of evidence that can bring him down, right? Reynolds nodded, his expression resolute. Yes, but we need more. We need to tie Stevens directly to the criminal activities he's been covering up. These papers give us a starting point, but we need the hard evidence, the kind that can't be ignored. We need to hit him where it hurts, and that means going after his connections. We need to get access to the people he's been working with, the ones he's been protecting. And we need to be careful. Stevens knows how to cover his tracks, but we're getting closer. Angela took a deep breath. The storm she had been riding out was about to come to a head, and she knew that there would be no turning back. The department was infected by corruption, and Stevens was at its center. But if they played their cards right, they could expose it all. She had to stay focused, for herself, for the department, and for the people who had been silenced for so long. We need to get this to Hayes, Angela said, her voice firm with determination. She'll know what to do with it, but we can't let Stevens know we're onto him. Not yet. If he suspects we found this, he'll destroy everything before we can act. Reynolds nodded in agreement. I'll get the documents to Hayes. But Captain, you need to prepare yourself. Stevens is going to fight back harder than ever. He's not going to let this go without a fight. If he thinks he's losing control, he'll do anything to protect himself. Angela's hands clenched into fists, the anger rising inside her. Let him try, she said through gritted teeth. We'll fight back. I'm not going down without exposing the truth. With that, Reynolds left the cell, taking the documents with him. Angela stood there, alone once again, but for the first time in days, she felt something like hope stirring within her. The pieces were finally falling into place, and the investigation was gaining momentum. But with that hope came a heavy sense of urgency. Every moment counted now. Hours passed, though it felt like an eternity, until the door to her cell opened once again. This time, it was Hayes, her expression set and determined. Pierce, Hayes said, her voice quiet but intense. We've got a real shot at bringing Stevens down, but we need to move fast. He's starting to get nervous. Angela's heart raced. What's the plan? Hayes sat down across from her, the tension palpable. We have enough to make a move, but we need to catch Stevens in the act. We can't rely on just documents. We need to get him tied to the crime scene, with irrefutable evidence that can't be ignored. Angela nodded. I'll do whatever it takes. I'm not backing down now. We're not backing down, Hayes affirmed, her eyes locking onto Angela's. But this is going to get dangerous. Stevens isn't just a rogue officer anymore. He's part of something much bigger. And if we don't act fast, he'll destroy everything we've worked for. The gravity of the situation settled in. This wasn't just about an arrest. It wasn't just about clearing Angela's name. It was about exposing a criminal syndicate that had infiltrated the very heart of law enforcement. And if they didn't move fast, Stevens would escape justice and possibly take the department down with him. We've got one shot at this, Hayes said, her voice calm but tinged with urgency. And we need to take it. Angela stood, her resolve hardening. Then let's make it count. As they walked out of the holding cell together, the weight of the upcoming confrontation hung over them like a storm on the horizon. The final battle was on the horizon, and Stevens' days of power were numbered.